Imagine living in a world where accusing someone of heresy was easier than proving anyone's innocence. A world where the dead could be dug up, put on trial, and condemned to the flames, even decades after being buried in peace. A world where the word of a single man could destroy an entire family, seize their property, stain their children's names forever. Now imagine that in that very world, a world of absolute terror, of forced silence and total submission, a single man rose up alone against the most powerful and feared machine of the Middle Ages and shouted, "No." Not as a plea. Not as a request. As a declaration of war. That man existed. His name was Bernard Délicieux. And what he did between 1299 and 1320 in medieval France was so impossible, so improbable, so absolutely insane, that the historical records themselves read like cinematic fiction. He had no army. He had no wealth. He had no noble title. He had only words, and he knew how to use them like no other human being of his era. With those words, he did something no one had ever managed to do before. He made the Inquisition run. Literally run. The great inquisitors, those men who made popes tremble and kings retreat, abandoned the city of Carcassonne in a panic, humiliated before a simple Franciscan friar. But every story of resistance has a price. And the price Bernard Délicieux paid was so brutal, so deliberately cruel, that you will feel the injustice burning inside your chest long before we reach the end. Because the same man who freed the Inquisition's prisoners died in exactly the same place where they died. In the dungeons. In chains. On bread and water. Alone. If you want to understand what an ordinary human being can do against a system of absolute power, and what that system does to those who dare to defy it, stay until the end. Because this story is not in the textbooks. It's not in Hollywood films. It is buried in the dusty archives of the 14th century, waiting for someone brave enough to tell it. And today, that someone is us. Hit like right now, not because you have to, but because Bernard Délicieux spent 20 years of his life making sure that stories like this one would never be erased. It was the year 1300. The region of Languedoc, in the south of France, still bore the scars of a war that had ended decades before, but whose wounds had never truly healed. The Albigensian Crusade, decreed by Pope Innocent III at the start of the 13th century, had wiped entire cities off the map, massacred populations, and exterminated the Cathars with an efficiency that turned even hardened soldiers pale. But exterminating bodies is easier than exterminating ideas. And the Inquisition knew that. What the Inquisition was doing in Languedoc at the end of the 13th century was not merely judgment. It was total control. It was institutionalized terror. The great Dominican inquisitors, known as the Hounds of God, had turned suspicion itself into a weapon. You did not need to be guilty to be destroyed. You only needed to be denounced. And once denounced, the mechanism moved on its own. Secret interrogations, anonymous witnesses, confessions torn out under torture, sentences ranging from humiliating pilgrimages all the way to the stake. There was no real defense. There was no effective appeal. There was only the machine, cold, relentless, insatiable. The Grand Inquisitor of Toulouse at this time was a man named Bernard Délicieux. If that name sounds familiar, it should. He is the same villain immortalized by Umberto Eco in The Name of the Rose. But in the novel, Délicieux seems almost theatrical. In historical reality, he was far worse. Methodical, relentless, absolutely convinced that he was carrying out the will of God. He had prosecuted hundreds of people. He had sent dozens to the stake. And he was comfortably installed at the heart of the region's religious and political power when a name began appearing in his reports with disturbing frequency: Bernard Délicieux. Bernard had been born around 1260 in Montpellier. He entered the Franciscan order in 1284 and spent years in Paris absorbing everything the greatest intellectual center in Europe had to offer. By the time he arrived in Carcassonne as prior of the local Franciscan convent, around 1299, he was not a naive man. He was a trained theologian, an exceptional orator, and someone who had studied the methods of the Inquisition in depth, not to support them, but to destroy them with their own rules. What Bernard saw in Carcassonne filled him with a holy fury that would never be extinguished. The Inquisition's prison, known as the Wall, was packed with people who had committed no crime other than knowing someone who had been accused of heresy. Entire families lived under the permanent shadow of suspicion. Merchants had lost their businesses because a resentful rival had anonymously denounced them. Children grew up knowing that their father's surname was already a curse. And then came the spark. In 1299, the Inquisitors decided to prosecute a man named Castel Fabre. The problem, the absolutely absurd problem that would be comical if it weren't tragic, was that Castel Fabre had died 21 years earlier, in 1278. He was buried in the very Franciscan convent where Bernard served as prior. The Inquisition wanted to exhume him, put his bones on trial for Cathar heresy, and condemn his memory, which in practice meant confiscating everything that had ever belonged to his family. Bernard looked at those bones. He looked at that accusation. And right there, he made a decision that would change the rest of his life. He was going to fight. Make no mistake, what Bernard did next was not merely courageous. It was strategically brilliant. He did not attack the Inquisition with violence. He attacked it with intelligence. He began investigating the Inquisitors' own records and discovered what he suspected. The charges against Castel Fabre were based on testimonies he publicly declared to be fraudulent, fabricated, built on rumors and on the fear of witnesses who said whatever the Inquisitors wanted to hear. He made that conclusion public. Not in whispers. In sermons. In public squares. In any space where he could gather a crowd. The people of Carcassonne had waited decades for someone to say out loud what everyone was thinking in silence. And when Bernard Délicieux opened his mouth, the dam broke. In July of 1300, when the Inquisitors realized that the narrative had escaped their control, that the Franciscan prior himself was publicly challenging the validity of their records and turning Carcassonne into an active field of resistance, they did something they had never done before in the entire history of the Inquisition in that region. They ran. They left Carcassonne. Temporarily, yes, but they left. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. The monster had taken a step back. And when a monster retreats, the people remember that the monster can be defeated. If you're feeling that strange mixture of hope and dread right now, that sense that this is going too well to end well, trust your instincts. Keep watching. 1301 was the year Bernard Délicieux decided to escalate the conflict to a level no one had ever attempted before. If the Inquisition was protected by Rome, the only way to contain it was to go to the king. To the King of France. To Philip IV, called by history Philip the Fair, for his physical appearance, but better described as Philip the Calculator, for his political nature. Bernard organized a delegation. He gathered representatives from Carcassonne and Albi, another city suffocating under the Inquisition, and marched to Senlis, where the royal court was established. What he said before the king entered history. Not because it was diplomatic. Because it was devastatingly true. Bernard looked at the King of France and said, with that voice that had the power to freeze crowds where they stood, that the methods of the Inquisition were so extreme, so distorted, so utterly contrary to any notion of justice, that not even St. Peter and St. Paul could defend themselves if subjected to these proceedings. The apostle who received the keys of the kingdom and the man who evangelized the Greco-Roman world, both would be condemned by the Inquisition of Languedoc. That single sentence captured the horror of the system better than any legal brief ever could. Philip listened. And, for reasons that included both genuine concern and political interest in weakening the Church's grip over his domains, he acted. The result was a royal ordinance placing the Dominican inquisitors under the control of the local bishops. It was a monumental victory. For the first time in decades, a leash had been placed on the Inquisition. When the news reached Languedoc, the region erupted. Not in violence, in hope. An explosive, disorderly hope, the dangerous kind that happens when people who have been oppressed for too long suddenly believe that change is possible. But the Inquisition was not an institution that accepted leashes. And Bernard Délicieux was watching every move Bernard Délicieux made with the cold, patient attention of a professional hunter. The decisive moment came on August 4, 1303. Bernard climbed to the pulpit to preach a sermon, but what came out of his mouth that day was not theology. It was a political bomb. He publicly revealed a secret agreement from 1299, a document that had circulated in the shadows of religious power, that classified all the inhabitants of Carcassonne as reformed heretics. What did that mean in practice? That any citizen of the city, if they committed the slightest religious misstep, any small act of disobedience toward the church, could be immediately condemned to the stake. All of them. The entire city had been marked. The silence that followed Bernard's sermon lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then Carcassonne exploded. Weeks after that sermon, something happened that had no precedent in the entire history of the medieval Inquisition. The people stormed the prison. Ordinary citizens, merchants, craftsmen, women, young men, marched against the wall, broke down the gates, and freed every prisoner held inside. It was a declaration. It was a revolution in miniature. And Bernard Délicieux had struck the match. But revolutions in miniature do not bring down empires. And what came next cost everything. 1304 was the year Bernard committed the most human error possible, despair. After years of fighting, of partial victories that were systematically reversed, of watching people being arrested, of feeling the crushing weight of a machine that kept running despite all his efforts, he did something that can only be understood as the cry of a man who could no longer bear to watch the suffering around him. He began to plot a political secession. The idea was to place Carcassonne, and potentially all of Languedoc, under the protection of Prince Friar of Majorca, from a rival house to the French crown. If Philip could not or would not contain the Inquisition permanently, perhaps an alternative ruler could. Bernard traveled personally to Perpignan carrying a letter sealed with the stamp of the consuls of Carcassonne, asking Friar to place the city under his protection. It was high treason. Bernard knew that. And he probably knew also that the plan was more improbable than anything he had tried before. But when you watch innocent people suffer for years on end and realize that the legitimate channels are not enough, when you understand that the system is broken in a way that cannot be fixed from the inside, despair takes shapes that cold logic cannot calculate. The plan failed. Philip found out. The response was immediate and brutal. 16 inhabitants of Carcassonne were hanged. The city received a devastating fine. And Bernard, astonishingly, inexplicably, was pardoned by the king. A mercy that, over time, would reveal itself to be more cruelly calculated than any immediate punishment. Because to be pardoned meant to continue. And to continue meant the machine could find him again later, when he was older, weaker, more isolated. From 1310, Bernard went to live in Béziers, where he joined the spiritual Franciscans, a wing of the order that had radicalized its interpretation of original Franciscan poverty and entered into direct conflict with the papacy. In 1317, Pope John XXII, a man of iron who had decided to sweep all Franciscan descent from the face of Europe, ordered that Bernard and his brothers appear in Avignon to answer for their disobedience. Bernard was more than 50 years old. He had been fighting for 2 decades. And now he was being taken as a prisoner to face the very power he had fought against his entire life. What happened in Avignon was the most precise description of what the Inquisition did to its enemies when it finally caught them. Bernard was interrogated. He was tortured. He was subjected to a process where accusations arrived by the mountain and the defense was an empty formality. There were 104 articles of accusation, 104, listing everything from obstructing the Inquisition to the charge of having attempted to poison Pope Benedict XI. And then, on September 3, 1319, the formal trial began in Castelnaudary. Think for a moment about what that tribunal was. Testimonies gathered in secret. No real possibility of cross-examination. Records made in Latin by scribes taking notes from witnesses who spoke in Occitan, a different language entirely, which meant that every word passed through a layer of translation and interpretation before reaching the page. Confessions obtained, quite possibly, under torture. A process designed not to discover the truth, but to confirm the conclusion that had already been decided before the trial ever began. Bernard testified. Despite everything, the torture, the age, the isolation, the certainty that the outcome was sealed, he testified with a calm and a clarity that the historical records themselves describe as remarkable. The man who had made the Inquisition flee Carcassonne 2 decades earlier was still there. Still himself. Still carrying that voice, that reasoning, that absolute refusal to bend his knee before injustice, even when injustice had absolute power over his body. On December 8, 1319, the sentence was read aloud. Bernard Délicieux was stripped of his clerical status, erased from the order he had served for more than 30 years. And he was condemned to life imprisonment in the wall of Carcassonne. The very prison his companions had stormed in 1303. The very wall he had spent decades trying to demolish. The judges, acknowledging his frailty, his age, and the tortures he had already endured, ordered that the harshest penalty, chains, bread, and water, be omitted from his sentence. It was almost merciful by the standards of the era. Then Pope John XXII intervened personally. Overruling the judge's decision, the Pope ordered the full penalty applied. Chains, bread, water. And he handed Bernard over to the Inquisitor Jean de Beaune so that the sentence would be carried out with absolute severity. Bernard Délicieux, the man who had defended the dead from posthumous accusations, who had marched to the King of France, who had preached the sermon that ignited a revolt, who had traveled to Majorca out of nothing but compassionate desperation, died a few months later. In early 1320. In chains. In the darkness of the very wall he had fought his entire life to bring down. He was around 60 years old. And he died alone. Stop. Breathe. And think about what just happened in this story. A man used nothing but words to make the Inquisition, the most powerful and feared institution in medieval Europe, retreat from an entire city. He used logic as a weapon and courage as a shield. He carried the voice of the people all the way to the King of France and wrested from him a royal ordinance that curtailed the Inquisitor's power. He ignited a sermon that resulted in the first and only mass liberation of Inquisition prisoners in the history of Languedoc. All of this with no army, no wealth, no title. And he died exactly where his enemies wanted him to die. It is easy to look at this as pure tragedy. As defeat. As proof that systems of power always crush those who challenge them. But there is something the historical records reveal with a disturbing clarity: the Inquisition never managed to erase Bernard Délicieux. 700 years later, his name still exists. The names of the inquisitors who tortured him also exist, but on lists of executioners, not heroes. Bernard's name is somewhere else entirely. In the same place as all the names of people who chose truth at the moment when truth was the most costly thing in the world. Bernard did not win the battle. But he proved that the battle could be fought. He proved that a single human being, armed with conviction and words, can push back what seemed invincible. He proved that silence is always a choice, and that choosing to speak, even when speaking carries a devastating price, is the most profoundly human act that exists. The friar who made the Inquisition run died in chains. But the Inquisition that killed him is also gone. And Bernard Délicieux is still here, 7 centuries later, being told by us, because stories like his do not die in dungeons. They escape. They always escape. If this story moved you, if you felt that mixture of awe, rage, and something that can only be called aching hope, share it now. Not for us. For Bernard. Because the only way to honor those who lived and died for truth is to make sure truth keeps being told. And if you want to keep being shaken by the stories that official history didn't want to preserve, subscribe and hit the bell. Because there is much more where this came from.